Darkness by Lord Byron, George Gordon Byron, 1788 to 1824. I had a dream, which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguish'd, and the stars did wander sparkling in the eternal space, rayless and pathless, and the icy earth swung blind and blackening in the moonless air. Morn came and came and brought no day, and men forgot their passions in the dread of this their desolation, and all hearts were chilled into a selfish prayer for light, and they did live by watchfires, and the thrones, the palaces of crowned kings, the huts, the habitations of all things which dwelled were burnt for beacons. Cities were consumed, and men were gathered round their blazing homes to look once more into each other's face. Happy were those who dwelt within the eye of the volcanoes, and their mountain torch a fearful hope was all the world contained. Forests were set on fire, but hour by hour they fell and faded, and the crackling trunks extinguished with a crash, and all was black. The brows of men by the despairing light wore an unearthly aspect. As by fits the flashes fell upon them, some lay down and hid their eyes and wept, and some did rest their chins upon their clenched hands and smiled. And others hurried to and fro, and fed their funeral piles with fuel, and looked up with mad disquietude on the dull sky, the pall of a past world. And then again with curses cast them down upon the dust, and gnashed their teeth, and howled. The wild birds shrieked, and terrified did flutter on the ground, and flap their useless wings. The wildest brutes came tame and tremulous, and vipers crawled and twined themselves among the multitude, hissing but stingless. They were slain for food. And war, which for a moment was no more, did glut himself again. A meal was bought with blood, and each sate sullenly apart, gorging himself in the gloom. No love was left. All earth was but one thought, and that was death, immediate and inglorious. And the pang of famine fed upon all entrails. Men died, and their bones were tombless as the flesh. The meagre by the meagre were devoured. Even dogs assailed their master, all save one. And he was faithful to a course, and kept the birds and beasts and famished men at bay, till hunger clung them. All the dropping dead lured their lank jaws. Himself sought out no food, but with a piteous and perpetual moan and quick desolate cry, licking the hand which answered not with a caress, he died. The crowd was famished by degrees, but two of an enormous city did survive, and they were enemies. They met beside the dying embers of an altar place, where had been heaped a mass of holy things for an unholy usage. They raked up and shivering, scraped with their cold skeleton hands the feeble ashes, and their feeble breath blew for a little life and made a flame, which was a mockery. Then they lifted up their eyes as it grew lighter, and beheld each other's aspects, saw and shrieked and died. Even of their mutual hideousness they died, unknowing who he was upon whose brow famine had written fiend. The world was void, the populous and the powerful was a lump, seasonless, herbless, treeless, manless, lifeless, a lump of chaos, a chaos of hard clay. The rivers, lakes, and oceans all stood still, and nothing stirred within their silent depths. Ships sailorless lay rotting on the sea, and their masts fell down piecemeal. As they dropped, they slept on the abyss without a surge. The waves were dead, the tides were in their grave, the moon their mistress had expired before, the winds were withered in the stagnant air, and the clouds perished. Darkness had no need of aid from them. She was the universe. Okay, this is a poem of Fire and Damnation by Lord Byron. Okay, his real name was George Gordon, and he became a lord when his father died. One of the great British poets of the Romantic movement. So what's this about? Well, when the poem starts, all light on the earth disappears. There's no light anywhere, not from the sun, not from the stars, not from the moon. And everyone's absolutely terrified. And that everybody bands together, yeah, and everybody thinks about each other. And they all pray for the light. And I think this is all talking about. It's like a metaphor, saying the differences in our society, the differences between the poor and the rich, and the poor suffer. It's talking about inequality, and what will happen in the future if we carry on with this inequality. Because the beginning of this, there is this darkness, and everybody becomes equal in the darkness. Yeah, and then the light comes back, and everybody wants to go back to the old world, and the situation gets worse and worse, and there is famine and great hunger, and effectively man just goes destroying everything with his greed. This is a bit like Revelation, yeah? I had a dream, which was not all a dream, so it wasn't a complete dream. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space. So the sun was extinguished, the sun went out, and the stars were wandering in space, rayless and pathless. So the stars didn't produce light. And the icy earth swung blind and blackening in the moonless air. So there was no sun, so the earth became cold. And there was no moon, so there was no light. Morning came and went, and came and brought no day. So morning came, the time for morning came, but there was no light. And all men forgot their passions in the dread. So people forgot the things that were important to them. Yeah, they were they were just terrified by this situation. Yeah, and they forgot about the things they want or they need or greed or things like this. and they forgot their passions in the dread of their desolation, their lack of light. And all hearts were chilled into a selfish prayer for light. So everybody wanted the light back. And they did live by watchfires, so they made big fires. And the thrones, the palaces of crowned kings, the huts, the habitations of all things which dwell, were burnt for beacons. So everybody joined together, and they burnt palaces and they burnt the houses of normal people, so everybody became equal. And there were no differences, and everybody had enough. Cities were consumed, and men were gathered round their blazing homes to look once more into each other's faces. So they started burning everything. They burnt cities, and people were sitting round these fires. But people were actually looking at each other. They were seeing each other as individuals. Yeah, they were saying that these are just men like me. Happy were those who dwelt within the eye of the volcanoes and their mountain torch. So people who lived near volcanoes were happy because there was some light from the volcanoes. Yeah, and the volcano, their mountain torch. This is the red lava at the top of the mountain. A fearful hope was all the world contained. So the whole world was living in fear, and they hoped that this wasn't going to continue. Forests were set on fire, so they started to burn the forests. But hour by hour they fell and faded, and the crackling trunks extinguished with a crash, and all was black. So they started burning the forests, and the forests burned. But then finally the light went out from these burning forests, and everything was black again. The brows of men by the despairing light wore an unearthly aspect. So men were despairing. They were despairing, and everybody felt that they were living in a different world. Yeah, the world had changed. As by fits, the flashes fell upon them. And here, suddenly there are flashes of light. And here the light suddenly comes back. Yeah, and suddenly there's light again. Some lay down and hid their eyes and wept. So some people laid on the ground and cried with happiness. And some did rest their chins upon their clenched hands and smiled. So they rested their chins on their hands that were held together, and they smiled. And others hurried to and fro and fed their funeral pyres with piles with fuel. And other people started running about, and they started wanting to go back to the past world. Yeah, they started to burn the fire that would burn their dead body. So they started going back to the old ways. And they looked up with mad disquietude on the dull sky. So they looked up at the sky again, and they could see it. So they looked up and they saw the pall, the shadow, the dark shape of a past world, of a world where everyone was the same. And then again with curses cast them down upon the dust. So they looked up and they looked at the sky that they could see now, and they thought about this past world, and then they looked down and they swore at the dust, at the ground, and they gnashed their teeth and howled, they lamented. And wild birds shrieked, and terrified did flutter on the ground, and flap their useless wings. So people and animals are now starting to go crazy. Yeah, the bird flutters and flaps its wings. The wildest brutes came tame and tremulous. So suddenly wild animals became tame and trembling. And vipers, these are snakes, crawled and twined themselves among the multitude, hissing but stingless. So snakes crawled and they came round in the multitude of people, hissing, sss, but they didn't sting, they didn't bite. And they were slain, they were killed for food. Okay, so everything's gone absolutely haywire, crazy. And war, which for a moment was no more, did glut herself again. So when the light had gone, there was no war. But then war came back, and war started again, and did glut himself, to feed, to eat as much until you're absolutely full, like a glutton. A meal was bought with blood. So people started killing each other for food. And each sate, this is from the verb sat, sullenly apart, gorging himself in the gloom. So each person sat angrily and sadly, filling himself with the bodies of the dead in the darkness. No love was left. Yeah, so love had gone. All earth was but one thought, and that thought was death, immediate and inglorious. So everybody thought about death and killing. Yeah, and they all started with that, and there was no glory, no wonder in that. So this is like a look at the future that awaits us if we carry on with our greed and our wars and things like that. And the pang, the pain of famine fed upon all entrails. So entrails are in intestines. So suddenly people are really hungry, and they fed upon the intestines. I think the intestines of men. Men died, and their bones were tombless as their flesh. So men started dying, and the bodies weren't buried. I think they were just eaten by other people. Yeah, so bodies didn't have a tomb, as the bodies didn't have flesh, didn't have meat on them, because it had been eaten by other people. Yeah, this is talking about people being greedy and destroying each other. The meagre by the meagre were devoured. Even dogs assailed their master. So the poor ate the poor. The poor people were competing with each other, were effectively killing and eating each other. And even dogs assailed their masters. So this to me sounds like a revolution. Yeah, the dogs were killing their masters. All save one, so all the dogs, except for one. And he was faithful to a course, and kept the birds and beasts and famished men at bay. So there was one dog, however, that was faithful, and he kept the birds and the beasts and the hungry men at bay. He kept them away from his master, till hunger clung them. All the dropping dead lured their lank jaws. Okay, so until they were taken, so he kept the birds and the beasts at bay until they were beaten by hunger or they dropped dead. Yeah, and it lured their lank, their straight jaws. Okay, so this dog kept the birds and beasts and people away until they were incapacitated by hunger or they dropped dead, so then they weren't able to try and eat him or his master. Himself, this is the dog, sought out no food, so this dog didn't look for food, but with a piteous and perpetual moan. So the dog was moaning, and a quick desolate cry, licking the hand which answered not with a caress, he died. So this dog, it didn't eat, and it licked the hand of its master, which did not stroke it and say, "Good dog, well done." And the dog finally died. The crowd was famished by degrees. So the crowd, the people, started dying of famish. They were hungry, so they started dying of hunger by degrees, bit by bit. But two of an enormous city did survive, and they were enemies. So two people out of an enormous city survived, but then these became enemies. They met beside the dying embers of an altar place. So they met where an altar or a religious building or a religious place had been burned, where had been heaped a mass of holy things for an unholy usage. So I think here they'd put all sorts of relics and holy things together to burn them. But I think here this is a criticism of the church, saying that the church is also acting in a greedy way, and it doesn't act in this holy way. It doesn't help as it should. It's looking for power. They raked up and shivering scraped with their cold skeleton hands the feeble ashes. So they got put all these ashes together with their cold hands, and their feeble breath blew for a little life and made a flame, which was a mockery. So they then made another flame out of what was left, and I think they burned more things. Then they lifted up their eyes as it grew lighter, and beheld each other's aspect. So they looked at each other, and they saw and shrieked and died. So they saw each other and they shouted, and then they died. Even of their mutual hideousness they died. So each saw what a horrible, disgusting person the other was, unknowing who he was upon whose brow famine had written fiend. So they didn't know who the other person was. And I think this is saying each of them, on their brow, on their forehead, was written the word a fiend, a monster, because of their hunger. But this famine, this hunger, this is hunger for more. This is greed. This is man wanting more and more and more, and creating more and more inequality in this world. The world was void. The populace and the powerful was a lump. So I think almost everybody is dead. The world was seasonless. There were no seasons. There were no herbs. There were no trees. There were no men. There was no life. A lump of death, just a collection of death. A chaos of hard clay. So this is from that man is made of clay, and we've gone back to clay. The rivers, lakes and oceans all stood still, so there was no movement on the water, and nothing stirred within their silent depths, so there was nothing alive in the waters. Ships sailorless lay rotting on the sea, so there's ships on the sea, and they're just rotting, but they've got no sailors. And their masts fell down piecemeal, so bits of their masts started to fall. And as they dropped, they slept on the abyss without a surge, so the masts fell down, and these floated on the dead waters. The waves were dead, without a surge. Without a surge is like a movement, a flow of water. The waves were dead. The tides were in their graves, so there was no, it's like the moon was gone, there were no tides. The moon, their mistress, had expired before. So the moon, which is what causes the tides, had gone, had died. The winds were withered in the stagnant air. So the winds disappeared, and the clouds perished. So the clouds died to perish. Darkness had no need of aid from them. She was the universe. So here I think we have the darkness where all of the world is dead, everything has been destroyed, and darkness again was the universe. So it's like we've come, I think the whole poem is a metaphor saying man has come from darkness where everybody was equal and shared everything equally. And then greed started to take over and competition. And we refused to share, and man became greedier and greedier. And there was war and war, and we just destroyed everything. And like that, we returned to darkness again. So, enough. If you enjoyed the video, give it a rating, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you soon. Bye for now. Darkness by Lord Byron.